Close your eyes and imagine the year is 1855. There are no cameras, no viral videos, no way to escape what your eyes are about to see. Justice is decided by crowds and cruelty is entertainment. Fire is not just a weapon, it is a message, a warning, a promise of pain. In those days, burning someone alive was meant to end a story. It was meant to leave nothing behind, no voice, no proof, no memory. But on one night, in front of people who believed fire never fails, something happened that shattered that belief forever. Witnesses would later argue, whisper, deny, and disappear. Records would be altered, names would be changed, but fear has a way of surviving even when truth is buried. And the fear from that night still lingers, because the fire did its job. Except one thing, it did not burn her. In 1855, America was a land where violence against black bodies was not hidden, but organized, announced, and justified. It was an era when cruelty did not need shadows. It stood openly in daylight, protected by law, tradition, and silence. Communities gathered not only to witness punishment, but to participate in it, because terror was considered a tool of order. Fires were lit not just to kill, but to erase identity, to turn a human life into smoke, so that no questions remained afterward. And yet, beneath official records and polished historical accounts, there existed another layer of history. One made of rumors, frightened whispers, and events so disturbing that even those who benefited from the system preferred to forget them. The incident that would later be tied to the name Iron Dillard was born in this climate of normalized brutality. Racial violence was not random, it followed rituals. Accusations were often vague, sometimes invented and always impossible to disprove. Once a person was marked, their fate was sealed long before any gathering took place. What mattered was the message sent to others who shared their skin color. Fear was the language of control, and fire was its loudest word. Communities had learned to expect screams, ashes, and silence after the flames died down. Nothing was meant to survive long enough to become a story. But some stories refuse to stay buried. What makes this incident different is not only what happened, but how quickly it vanished from official memory. County logs from that year show gaps. Names are missing. Dates feel intentionally vague. In places where details should exist, there is only absence, as if someone reached back through time and tore out pages. Historians would later note that 1855 saw an unusual number of unverified disturbances in certain regions, a phrase often used to disguise events that frightened even those in power. This was not because records were poorly kept, but because some truths were considered dangerous. Eyewitness culture at the time relied heavily on oral testimony, and that is where the first cracks appeared. People spoke of a public punishment that did not end as planned. They spoke of a young black girl whose presence unsettled the crowd even before the fire was lit. She was described as calm in a way that felt wrong to those watching, not pleading, not resisting, not reacting the way victims were expected to react. In a society that demanded visible fear from the oppressed, her stillness alone was unsettling. Racial violence depended on predictability. The system functioned because everyone knew how these events were supposed to go. The crowd would feel powerful, the victim would be destroyed, and the memory would fade into justification. But that night, predictability failed. The fire, meant to be final, became uncertain. And uncertainty is dangerous to any system built on dominance. When violence does not behave, it exposes weakness. The name Iron Dillard did not exist before this incident. It emerged afterward, shaped by shock rather than identity. People did not know what else to call her. Iron symbolized something unbreakable, something that could not be consumed. Dillard, believed by some to be a distorted version of a family name or a place, became a label detached from any traceable lineage. This was not accidental. Removing her from documented ancestry made it easier to dismiss her as myth later on. What remains chilling is how quickly denial followed fear. Some witnesses retracted statements within days, others left town entirely. A few insisted the fire had been poorly built, despite multiple confirmations that it was prepared according to the same methods used countless times before. Science was invoked selectively, not to seek truth, but to bury it. The same people who trusted fire as an executioner suddenly claimed it could fail, as long as the failure could be explained away. Yet explanations never aligned. One account contradicted another. Some said the fire never touched her skin. Others claimed it burned, but left no marks. A few whispered that the flames changed color, though they refused to repeat that detail publicly. These inconsistencies did not weaken the story, they strengthened its terror. When lies disagree, it often means truth is being avoided. The most disturbing aspect is not what the fire did or did not do, but the reaction afterward. Instead of celebration, there was silence. Instead of closure, there was erasure. People behaved as if acknowledging the event would invite something back into their lives. Fear shifted direction. It was no longer directed only at the victim, but at the possibility that the natural order they believed in could fail them. History prefers clean endings. It prefers ashes. What it cannot tolerate are moments that suggest power is not absolute. That is why this incident exists today, only in fragments, in side notes, in stories told carefully and without names. The forgotten violence of 1855 produced many deaths, but it also produced one unresolved presence, a crack in the narrative of control, a reminder that even in the darkest systems, something can happen that refuses to be fully destroyed. The figure remembered as Iron Dillard exists in history more like a shadow than a person, shaped by fragments rather than facts. No birth record has been found that clearly matches the name, and no census from the period lists her in a way that can be confirmed. This absence is not unusual for black children in the mid-1800s, especially those born into bondage or extreme poverty, where names were often changed, misspelled, or erased entirely. What makes her different is that the name Iron Dillard appears suddenly after the incident, as if it was created to describe what people saw rather than who she was. Those who claimed to have known her before that night described her as quiet, observant, and unsettlingly composed. She was said to be young, though accounts differ on her exact age, which only deepens the mystery. Some said she was barely a child. Others insisted she was old enough to understand exactly what was being done to her. What they agreed on was her presence. She did not blend into the background. Even before the fire, people noticed her stillness, the way she watched without flinching, as if she was already separated from the world around her. The name Iron was not given lightly. In the 1800s, iron was a symbol of permanence and punishment. Shackles were iron, chains were iron, tools of labor and control were iron. To compare a black girl to iron was unthinkable in a society that saw her as fragile, disposable, and replaceable. The name carried fear because it inverted the natural order people believed in. Iron was meant to bind her, not describe her. Dillard is more difficult to trace. Some believe it was the surname of a plantation owner or landholder nearby. Others think it was the name of a region or road that later disappeared from maps. There is also the possibility that it was never a surname at all, but a distortion passed along through oral retellings. What matters is that the name stuck, not in ink, but in memory. People remembered it because it gave form to something they could not explain. As stories spread, Iron Dillard became less of a girl and more of a symbol. Some whispered she was cursed, others claimed she was protected, though protected by what no one dared to say aloud. In a deeply religious society, supernatural explanations were dangerous. To suggest divine intervention would challenge the idea that the violence was justified. To suggest something darker would imply that the fire had awakened something it should not have touched. So most people chose silence. Descriptions of her appearance vary wildly, another sign of fear shaping memory. Some said her skin looked unchanged after the fire. Others claimed it carried a dull sheen, like heated metal left to cool. A few insisted her eyes reflected the flames without blinking. These details grew sharper the further the story moved from the original event, as if distance allowed imagination to fill in what terror refused to process in the moment. What is striking is how often her humanity disappears in these accounts. She is rarely described as crying, pleading, or speaking. Instead, she is described as watching, standing, enduring. This transformation from person to presence reveals more about the witnesses than about her. They could not reconcile what they saw with the idea of a powerless victim, so they turned her into something else, something safer to fear than to understand. There are hints that authorities attempted to redefine her identity after the incident. Later references suggest she was labeled unstable, sick, or unnatural, language often used to dismiss those who disrupted social order. By stripping her of normality, they could explain away the event without admitting failure. If she was abnormal, then the system was still intact. Fire still worked. Power was still real. Yet the name Iron Dillard refused to disappear. It traveled through communities in hushed tones, often used as a warning rather than a story. Children were told not to ask about her. Adults avoided details. In some places, her name was spoken only at night, when fear felt less dangerous than daylight truth. What remains is a haunting paradox. The name given to erase her humanity is the very thing that preserved her existence. Iron Dillard is not remembered for who she was, but for what could not be done to her. The name stands as a marker of failure, a label born from shock, and a reminder that sometimes history creates monsters not because they exist, but because people need a way to survive what they have witnessed. The fire was meant to be the end, not the beginning. In 1855, public burnings followed a pattern that had been repeated so often it no longer required explanation. The structure was assembled with care, the materials chosen for efficiency, the outcome assumed before the first spark touched wood. This was not chaos disguised as justice. It was ritualized violence, rehearsed and trusted. Those responsible knew exactly how long it should take, what it should look like, and how it should feel for everyone involved. Fire, after all, had never failed them before. Witnesses described the preparations as deliberate and methodical. Dry timber stacked tight, oil poured generously, the air already heavy with the promise of smoke. The heat was expected to build quickly, to overwhelm the body before the mind could fully process the pain. This was considered mercy by those who believed in such acts. There was confidence in the crowd, an ugly calm that comes from familiarity. No one came expecting uncertainty. No one came prepared to question the outcome. When the flames were lit, the first moments followed expectation. Fire climbed eagerly, fed by oil and air, crackling loud enough to silence murmurs. Heat pushed people back, forcing distance while still allowing spectacle. The smell of burning wood filled the space, thick and choking. All signs pointed toward a familiar ending. And then time began to stretch. Instead of screams, there was silence. Instead of frantic movement, there was stillness. People waited for the moment when the body would react, when pain would assert itself in sound and motion. Seconds passed, then minutes. Unease crept in quietly at first, a subtle shift in posture, glances exchanged without words. Fire was supposed to dominate, to force submission. What it faced instead was resistance without struggle. Some claimed the flames wrapped around her without fully touching, bending in unnatural ways. Others insisted they saw fire consume everything except skin. There were disagreements almost immediately, as if reality itself fractured under the weight of what was happening. A few people moved closer, squinting through smoke, trying to convince themselves they were mistaken. But the longer the fire burned, the harder denial became. The crowd's reaction began to change. Laughter faded into confusion. Confidence dissolved into something sharper, more dangerous. Fear, not the controlled fear they had come to enforce, but a personal fear, the kind that asks what this means for them. Fire was supposed to be final. If fire could fail, then nothing was guaranteed. Accounts mention a moment when someone shouted that the fire needed more fuel. Oil was added, flames surged higher, heat intensified. The crowd braced for the inevitable correction. Instead, the same impossible stillness remained. The fire roared, but its power felt hollow, as if it was performing rather than acting. This second failure shattered the remaining certainty. People began to step back, not just from the heat, but from the scene itself. Descriptions of her during this time are disturbingly consistent in one way. She did not beg. She did not cry out. She did not collapse. Whether this was shock, strength, or something else entirely, no one could agree. What they could not deny was that she remained standing far longer than any body should. Her silhouette remained visible through the smoke, unbroken, unmoving, a shape that refused to be erased. As the fire began to die down, confusion turned into panic. Some witnesses later admitted they expected to see charred remains once the flames subsided. Instead, there was a body where a body should not have been. Intact, breathing, alive. The realization did not arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like a sickness, as people processed what their eyes were telling them. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. No cheers, no closure, just the sound of embers settling and people shifting their weight, unsure of what to do next. Authority faltered in that moment. Those in charge hesitated, their certainty exposed as fragile. Orders were unclear, the ritual had broken, and no one knew how to repair it. Fear quickly turned practical. If the fire did not work, then the event could not be allowed to stand as it was. Some accounts suggest hurried discussions, others mention abrupt dispersal. People left without speaking, as if staying too long would invite consequences. The spectacle ended not with satisfaction, but with an unspoken agreement that what had just happened could not be allowed to exist. Later explanations tried to reclaim control: poor construction, faulty materials, exaggeration. Each excuse attempted to shrink the event back into something manageable, but those who were there knew the difference between a weak fire and a failed one. They had seen countless burnings. They knew what should have happened. What haunted them was not just that the fire failed, but that it failed publicly. Too many eyes had witnessed the same impossible endurance. Too many minds had been forced to confront the idea that power, once assumed absolute, could be challenged without violence, without rebellion, without explanation. The fire was meant to send a message. Instead, it exposed one. The stories that survived the fire did not survive intact. They fractured the moment they were spoken, bending under fear, denial, and the urgent need to make sense of what could not be explained. Eyewitness accounts, once the strongest currency of truth in that era, became unreliable not because people did not see, but because what they saw threatened the foundations of their understanding. Memory became a battlefield, and each retelling revealed less about the event itself and more about the terror it left behind. Some witnesses insisted the fire never truly touched her, that the flames curled away at the last moment as if repelled. Others argued just as fiercely that the fire consumed everything around her but left her body untouched. These two versions cannot exist together, yet they do, preserved side by side in whispered testimonies. This contradiction is not evidence of fabrication, but of panic. When the mind cannot accept reality, it reshapes it into something survivable. Science, such as it was understood at the time, offered no comfort. Fire behaves according to laws that were already well known. Skin blisters, hair burns, lungs fail. There was no accepted mechanism for a living body to remain unharmed under those conditions. That is why many accounts lean heavily on visual distortions. Smoke was blamed, distance was blamed, angle of sight was blamed. Anything that could introduce doubt was seized upon. Yet doubt could not erase certain shared details. Multiple witnesses, separated by time and geography, described the same unsettling calm, the same absence of visible injury, the same moment of realization when expectation collapsed. These common threads appear even in accounts that otherwise contradict each other. They suggest that while memory may distort details, it struggles to erase the emotional core of an experience. Religious explanations surfaced quickly, but they were carefully controlled. Some whispered that it was a sign, though they refused to say of what. Others suggested divine intervention, but retracted the claim almost immediately. To frame the event as holy would imply that the violence itself had been judged. That was a dangerous implication in a society that relied on moral certainty to justify cruelty. Safer to dismiss it as illusion than to question righteousness. There were darker whispers as well, ones that never appeared in any written form. People spoke of curses, of forces awakened by injustice, of things that respond when cruelty crosses an unseen line. These ideas spread quietly, usually at night, usually among those who felt powerless themselves. Such explanations did not seek understanding, they sought distance. If the event could be labeled unnatural, then it could be avoided rather than confronted. What makes the eyewitness record especially unsettling is how often people later denied their own words. Statements given in private were reversed in public. Details shared in confidence were erased when repeated officially. Fear of consequence reshaped testimony in real time. Admitting the truth meant admitting that the system had failed and failure was not tolerated. Inconsistency became a survival strategy. Some accounts mention physical sensations experienced by the crowd rather than visual ones. A sudden drop in temperature, a ringing silence when the fire should have been loudest, a feeling of pressure, as if the air itself had changed. These details are often dismissed by historians as emotional exaggeration, but their repetition suggests something more complex. Trauma does not record events cleanly, it records impact. The most troubling contradictions involve time. Estimates of how long the fire burned vary wildly, from a few moments to what felt like an eternity. This distortion is a known effect of shock, but in this case, it reinforces how deeply the event disrupted perception. Time itself seemed unreliable, stretched and compressed by fear and disbelief. Attempts to reconstruct the event using logic fall apart quickly. If the fire was weak, why did experienced witnesses react with panic? If the accounts were exaggerated, why were records altered rather than simply dismissed? If it was a simple mistake, why did silence follow instead of correction? Each rational explanation raises more questions than it answers. Historians often rely on consistency to determine credibility, but in this case, inconsistency is the most credible feature. When people lie together, their stories align. When they are frightened by the same truth, their stories fracture in similar ways. The contradictions point towards something shared but unprocessable. The absence of a single accepted version is not a failure of documentation, but evidence of collective denial. The event resisted explanation not because it lacked witnesses, but because it produced too many, each carrying a piece of something no one wanted to hold in full. What remains is a mosaic of fear, shaped by eyes that saw more than they were prepared to understand, and memories that bent under the weight of impossible endurance. After the night of the fire, the most deliberate act was not what was done, but what was undone. Silence moved faster than truth, sealing mouths before questions could form. Official records that should have captured the event instead dissolved into vagueness. Dates blurred, names vanished, descriptions softened into harmless phrases that concealed more than they revealed. What could not be explained was not investigated, it was buried. This was not neglect, it was strategy. Erasure has always been a tool of power, especially when fear threatens authority. To acknowledge the incident would have meant admitting that the system failed in front of witnesses. It would have meant confronting the possibility that violence, the very thing used to maintain control, could lose its certainty. That risk was unacceptable, so the story was dismantled piece by piece until it resembled rumor rather than record. Those who spoke too openly found themselves isolated. Some relocated suddenly, others changed their accounts. A few were remembered as unreliable long before they were remembered at all. Credibility was weaponized. If a witness could be labeled unstable, emotional, or ignorant, then their testimony could be dismissed without examination. This tactic did not disprove the event, it neutralized it. Language played a crucial role in the disappearance. When references could not be erased entirely, they were distorted. The incident became an irregular disturbance, or an unverified account. Such phrases drained the event of specificity, turning a terrifying moment into an administrative footnote. Bureaucracy became a smothering force, capable of suffocating even the most extraordinary occurrence. Yet the story refused to die completely. It survived in margins, in side conversations, in warnings passed down rather than written down. Communities that had learned to distrust official history preserved their own versions, though they guarded them carefully. The name Iron Dillard lingered like a scar, mentioned without detail, as if too much description might summon something back. Over time, the story evolved, not because it was exaggerated, but because it was starved of context. When facts are removed, imagination rushes in to fill the space. This made it easier for skeptics to dismiss the entire account as folklore. Myth was safer than memory. Myth could be laughed at. Memory demanded reckoning. What makes the silencing especially effective is that it aligned with existing prejudices. A black girl surviving fire did not fit into the accepted order of the world. It was easier to believe the story false than to accept its implications. This bias did not need to be enforced. It operated automatically, filtering disbelief through social norms that already existed. Attempts by later historians to trace the incident ran into walls that felt intentional. Archives contained references to documents that no longer existed. Local histories skipped entire periods. Personal diaries stopped abruptly around the relevant dates. The gaps were too consistent to be accidental. Absence itself became evidence. Even skepticism plays a role in the erasure. Demands for proof are reasonable, but when proof has been systematically destroyed, skepticism becomes another form of silence. The story is caught in a trap. It cannot be proven because it was erased, and it was erased because it could not be allowed to be proven. What remains most unsettling is how effective the disappearance was. Many lived their entire lives unaware that such an event had ever been whispered about. The system succeeded not by rewriting history completely, but by narrowing it until only what was comfortable remained. Violence could be remembered, failure could not. And yet, the very act of erasure leaves a residue. Something lingers in the unanswered questions, in the unease that surfaces when fragments are placed side by side. Why was there no punishment for those who failed? Why did the community respond with fear instead of correction? Why did silence feel safer than explanation? The story of Iron Dillard exists today not as a complete narrative, but as a pressure point in history. It presses against certainty. It exposes how quickly truth can be smothered when it threatens belief. The fire was meant to destroy a body, but what truly frightened those who witnessed it was that something survived, not just physically, but conceptually, challenging the idea that power is absolute, that violence is final, that history always belongs to those who write it, leaving behind a presence that resists closure, lingering in fragments, whispers, and gaps that refuse to close.